right, welcome back. Welcome to the first post-lunch session. Hopefully you all had a great lunch. I'm really excited for this session. We are talking about creating incentives for action, research, regulation, and rewards. We're talking about how governments and industry and international organizations can really employ computational science to help end slavery and really do so in a responsible and an effective way. We have a really fantastic group of people. They're each talking, I think, from a different stakeholder perspective. We're going to start with Keith Marzullo from the University of Maryland. We'll hear from Dan Lopresti from CCC, the Computing Community Consortium, and then from Sophia Tu from IBM. And I think we're going to be focusing really collectively, I hope, across this plenary, on how we encourage innovation, how we develop a shared research agenda, how we balance purpose and profit, especially in the business community, and taking, I think, quite a practical, quite a forward-looking approach in this session. It has some pretty high stakes. This is the last sort of formal content-based session of Code 8.7. So we're still looking here for more opportunities, but we're also picking up, I think, on the last session before lunch, looking for some strategies. So how do some key stakeholders from academia, from industry, from government help build that strategy, build infrastructure, work across barriers of sector motivation, epistemologies, pace, cultures, different needs, to deliver what could be the most creative, responsive, nimble, effective, innovative, adaptive anti-slavery movement that this world has ever seen. And I say that as someone a long time ago who was trained as a historian of anti-slavery, and really with deep awareness that that anti-slavery usable past that Kevin Bales referenced in his keynote yesterday includes abolitionist forebears from the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries who endlessly were trying to harness and adapt their own time's technologies to end slavery. So it may seem, for example, that this is the first time abolitionists have mapped slavery from space using satellites, but mapping and visualizing slave labor has a really long tradition in abolitionism. So what successes and failures did past abolitionists encounter when they were mapping and quantifying slavery? How can we learn from those examples? Tech has been at the heart of good anti-slavery for 200 years. So ultimately, how can we now move this effort, history's fourth great anti-slavery movement, into its final phase towards the target of global abolition by 2030? So my hope is that this session will move us really well into the final session where we will hopefully, I think, commit to next steps. And with that, I'm going to hand over to Keith.
Am I on? I'm on. Great. Thank you, Zoe. My charge is to talk about what we can do at the role of the government and the university to encourage innovation. So I'm going to start off with the standard model of how research happens at a university, at least at a technical part of an American university. Money flows from the government and ideas flow from the university. This is cynical, but it is true that, at least in computer science in the United States, the vast majority of funding comes from the government, and the vast majority of that comes from the National Science Foundation. I think the number is something like 70%. And so this is a strength and a weakness, but it's appropriate to try to put the two together because so much of the innovation happening in the tech sector is coming from funding from the federal government. This is more what we've been talking about here. We've been talking a lot about the intersection of information technology, the use of computation, AI, and such to be able to make sense out of all the information that is coming to us. We've also been talking a bit about the intersection of information and policy, and also technology and policy. I think it was, let me just look at my notes. Anjali, that's right, in her process model was talking about the intersection of technology and policy, looking at the ways in which the AI can be used to help the different stages of understanding and enforcing actions against human trafficking. And there certainly has been some discussion about the intersection of information, intersection with policy. We heard that from Dominique, who was talking about getting information to law enforcement, for example. So all of these intersections take place. But before you get too jaundiced, of course, it still requires funding for all this to work. We need to find some way to be able to make this work. The other difficulties we have when thinking about this from a university point of view is, well, it's multidisciplinary. You need to bring a lot of people to the table, not just technology, but also social scientists, public policy, perhaps people from public health, perhaps people from journalism. There's many different touch points you can think of on this. And also, it's very much outcome oriented. Certainly, we all believe in scholarship. We all want to write papers and get things in journals and such, but this kind of work here is really motivated much more towards having an outcome, actually changing the world. And that is sometimes hard to mesh within the university because universities are first and foremost about scholarship. And indeed, these two are linked, even though I put them on different lines. We are multidisciplinary because we are outcome oriented. If you just want to be scholarly, you would just stick in your discipline. So that's a difficulty that we have. So I have 3 ideas, having listened to us, of what we can do to try to move this forward. The first one is what I call go large. By this I mean center scale activities. If you start thinking of things that are multidisciplinary, you naturally think of centers, and I'm a dean, so I instinctively think of centers, of course. Centers are important because you can bring people together and solve large problems. Of course, the funding is an interesting issue. I was just talking with Zoe about how the Rights Lab is funded. It sounds like it's funded in a very forward-thinking, innovative way by the university. That's wonderful. At the University of Maryland, we have several centers that are funded by individual government agencies. The START Center on Terrorism, for example, in the Department of Homeland Security. So funding is an issue. One insight I might put here is an observation made by Dr. Subir Suresh. He was the director of the National Science Foundation, and he created something he called Science Across Virtual Institutes, a SAVI program. And what was nice about SAVI was it was able to do a lot for a very little bit of money by basically coordinating the activities across different research units. We did something with Finland, for example, in wireless. And so one idea would be, rather than have to take on the huge investment that a center has, say like what the Rights Lab is there some way we can use this ICT that we've developed to link things across the various universities to move this agenda forward, the idea of a virtual center. The second topic is go broad. Idea here is, can we define research agendas that have as broader impacts the kinds of things that we're trying to do here in Delta 8.7? A wonderful example of this is happening at the National Science Foundation. They have a program in operations research that is looking at illicit trafficking, traffic networks. This includes not only human traffic, but also like drug trafficking. And Deborah is here smiling. She was the division director, I think, when this started. And it's wonderful work. And I was just sitting next to a person from Ohio State who's actually doing research in this area, looking at the choke points on this. I think there's a lot we can do in trying to move the agenda of Delta 8.7 forward by including in broader impacts. The way to do this is not easy, of course. You have to talk with people at the funding agencies, and also need to be able to reach out to the conferences, find ways to talk with people at their conferences and say, here is our topic, and get them engaged at say, ICHCAI or conferences like that. So that's my second idea, go broad. The other one is go experiential. By this, I mean education. We're at an interesting time in American universities right now. Interesting is always a difficult word. Roughly 50% of the states in the United States are enacting or passing legislation that is addressing free speech at universities right now. That is, we're in a period where many of state universities are feeling attacked by their own state legislatures. And that's just a fact. I'm not saying it's good or bad. But it is a wonderful time for college presidents right now to find ways to get their students interacting in ways that is separate of the political dialogue that we're having, and yet is moving things forward. My own president, Wallace Lowe, I saw him do this at a board of directors meeting, board of trustees meeting, where he started talking about the new citizenship and getting idea of getting students interested and work with the community, working with the public. And you could almost see to the board of directors or trustees starting to open their wallets. They just found this to be a very motivational thing. And so there's a lot that we can do in the space of engaging the power of students in the kinds of problems that we're trying to solve here. I know this conflicts some of the other discussion we've had in terms of ensuring we have exactly the right data and solving exactly the right problems, but I think we can do both. Some examples of programs like this are at the University of California, San Diego. There's a Global Ties program. At my own University of Maryland, there's, under the School of Public Policy, there's the Do Good initiative. And one of the things we do in that is what's called a Global Data Challenge. in which we give students data from various agencies and organizations for them to look at something to do social good, increase social good. So you can imagine having an experiential component of this which could engage universities, engage the students in a way that not only could look for new solutions, but also get the public excited about it as well. So that's the third thing, go experiential. Thank you. So just summarizing, what I said here was that universities are a rich source of innovation, and they work very closely with government to do what they do. And so I was suggesting going large, especially in the idea of virtualizing centers, going broad, especially reaching out to stakeholders to try to communicate what Delta 87 is doing, and go experiential. Thank you.
Perfect, thank you. And I'm going to hand over straight to Dan.
Great, thanks. I also want to see if I got my stuff here. Great. It's great to follow my colleague Keith, who's a fellow member of the CCC Council. What I'd like to do is tell you our ideas for more broadly engaging the U.S. computing research community. There's tremendous work being done in this room and with our colleagues, applying computational techniques, including some basic research to the problems of the fight against human trafficking. What we want to do is actually take this message out to a much bigger group of our colleagues who are doing basic research in computing in the U.S. So that is indeed the role we have on the CCC. So I want to say a little bit about this organization, which some of you probably are wondering what it is. It's largely a volunteer-driven organization, and it's actually fairly small. There are 20 council members. We actually have a significant fraction of the council in the room with us here today. So Nadia, Keith, and myself, and Robness is the director, and Kari Douglas is one of the staff members. It's a very small group, and it's largely a volunteer group with a small professional staff. But we do a very big job engaging with the computing research community across the U.S. and in fact in North America, largely in the academic environment, but also involving some industrial research as well. So more than 200 universities in the U.S. that grant PhDs in computer science are members of CRA, and CCC is a committee under the CRA. So we do things like we organize workshops, we organize what are called blue sky tracks at existing conferences that push the community to think outside their normal lines of thinking. We produce white papers, we produce social media, a lot of communications. We interact with government agencies, with policymakers, and as well as with the community too. We're sort of the glue between all of those important entities. And this is the important organizing role that we play. So we don't do research, we don't fund research, we individually do research, but not as part of CCC, but we actually bring the community together and engage with the community. And that's our role, and that's what we hope to bring to the table here for Code 8.7. So the best term to describe what we are is we're a catalyst. So we're not the thing that does something, we're the thing that helps the things that do things. And we've actually been very, very effective in this regard. CCC is a relatively young organization, about 10 years old. CRA has been around for quite a bit longer. So the main way that we are able to accomplish this is obviously by having our hands and our minds in the community, but in terms of CCC, we have task forces. And these task forces are relatively small. You can see the council itself is fairly small, agile. Every year we tend to refocus them on topics that we find interesting, and task forces will then go off. They'll engage with the community. They'll often produce one or more workshops. They'll produce white papers and communications, and they'll often interact with funding agencies and with government policymakers as well. So the task forces are the way we get things done. I just want to show you the list of task forces this year, not that you're necessarily that interested in the deep mechanics of the organization, but if you see the topics of the task forces, these are things that we identified as being important from a basic research standpoint from our community, and you can see that the vast majority of these overlap with the topics that have been discussed here at the Code 8.7 conference. So cybercrime, cybersecurity, in fact, that's indeed where these discussions live, the Code 8.7 discussions live, and Nadia, Keith, and I are members of that task force. But human-computer interaction, health, information integrity and provenance, intelligent infrastructure, fairness and accountability, almost everything there has a direct relevance to the topics that we've been discussing here at Code 8.7. So there's a lot of reasons to be optimistic about this engagement. In terms of what we're able to accomplish, you might ask, like, what are 20 very busy academics and industry people who have real jobs and then sort of volunteer for CCC able to do? These are some examples of some past activities where we were certainly not the only motivating force behind it, but we were a large spark behind what ultimately became very large federal investments in the U.S. On basic research. The one there's the BRAIN initiative. There's one that's aimed in the semiconductor industry, strategic computing, high performance computing. The one on the right, I think, is the one that may be most interesting and relevant. That's Smart and Connected Health. It's a very large program both at NSF and NIH. And you can see the series of workshops that we held, CCC organized, that brought together the different interests, those with interests, stakeholders, and computing researchers together that ultimately were part of what led to these large federal initiatives in smart and connected health. So we're very proud to be able to work with the community, to be able to bring them together and have this sort of effect. And indeed, that's what we're proposing to do in support of Code 8.7 as well. So in terms of, Nadia and the pipeline discussion earlier was really very nice in laying out this sort of all the aspects of what needs to be done to actually have an impact on the ground. And we're deeply cognizant of those stages of the pipeline that are incredibly important beyond the basic research. Basic research itself is not going to do the whole job. But on the other hand, that is really what our mission is here, is with CCC and engaging with the competing research community, is that sort of what Nadia identified as 6.1, if you want to use DARPA language, the basic research that feeds into the applied research that ultimately is translated down to having an effect on the task at hand. So it turns out that as we are having this discussion here, the AI research community, the basic research community in the US is having its own discussions about long-term views of what AI research ought to be over the next 10 or 20 years. This is an amazing target, you can imagine. AI, machine learning has done so much. What is the field's view of what we ought to be focusing on the next 10 or 20 years? So that's actually what I pulled out of their discussions. About 75% of what they're discussing applies directly to the conversations that have taken place here. Those bullet points aren't as a result of the notes I made. I made separate notes here, but this is actually from the AI community. So we're actually speaking in the same direction in terms of the fundamental basic AI problems that need to be solved. I won't elaborate on all of the details there, but I'll just sort of give you a couple of the points to explain what those bullets mean. So open knowledge repositories, it's recognized this is an important fundamental need that we need to have to be able to advance AI, basic AI research. And this is what we were hearing earlier, how to integrate heterogeneous knowledge, knowledge capture and dissemination, knowledge integration and refinement, diversified use and reasoning at scale. This exactly speaks to some of the problems we heard about earlier today and yesterday. Contextualized AI, customization of general capabilities, cognizance of environment, and social cognition. Again, very directly relating to some of the topics that we heard about earlier. Collaboration, modeling human mental states, social norms and common sense, supporting complex teamwork. Again, very directly relatable to the discussions that have taken place. Trust and responsibility, transparency and explanation, boundaries and responsibility, right? Again, very directly relevant. Diversity of interaction channels, information fusion, privacy preservation across channels, multimodal explanations. We heard about some of that yesterday. Diversity of human ability and context. Improving online interaction, a reputation and fairness, productive communication and collaboration, robust and trustworthy machine learning. I think that speaks to itself. Deeper learning for challenging tasks. Again, this is more in the area of machine learning. And then integrating symbolic and numeric knowledge, explainable and instructable AI. So these are topics that the community has identified. So our goals moving forward for Code 8.7 is to pool our combined talents and energies to fight to end modern slavery. And CCC has a number of ways in which we plan to contribute, including catalyzing the research community, engaging with funding agencies and policymakers, and serving as this very important bridge between the basic research and the other things that need to be done, but also connecting with our international colleagues too. CCC to date has been largely US focused, and we understand this is an international effort that we need to be part of. So the last slide explains what we intend to do to help advance, but also we're very interested in your input, your suggestions, and your ideas. This is very much a collaborative effort, but this is just what we did, brainstorming amongst ourselves. That's it.
Fantastic. I think we'll go straight over to Sophia and then launch into the discussion from there by James.
Okay, so thanks everyone for having me. Sophia Tu with IBM, and I feel like Keith and Dan, you did a great job of kind of setting up some of the things that I want to talk about. So my session, I think, is a little bit misleadingly named Purpose Over Profits, because I would say that what we're interested in our model for impact is really purpose alongside profits. I am with the corporate citizenship division of IBM, and our kind of model for impact is that we engage with other lines of business in figuring out points of intersection where IBM can contribute our technology and talent to make an impact on issues that are important to the communities where we live and work and do business. So our work in anti-trafficking started in 2015 with the Stop Traffic in the UK, and we saw an opportunity there to contribute some of our technology from our security portfolio, I2 link analysis, to help them discern hotspots and other patterns in the data that they had access to but didn't have a way of analyzing in this fashion. And so through training them and working with some of their partners, which, so echoing the themes of the multidisciplinary cross-sector collaboration, they were working with law enforcement in the UK, France, and Belgium, as well as Europol and Western Union, and they were able to, within a couple of months, crack and shut down a ring of 32 traffickers who were based in Belgium. So we were really excited by this kind of initial impact and wanted to really expand that work. So over the course of the past couple of years, we've worked with Stop the Traffic on developing a mobile app that enables anyone in the world to contribute to report suspected incidents of trafficking. We provide hosting and analysis of that data on the back end. And then we've also expanded our partnership to a network of NGO partners around the world. And through that contribution of technology and expertise, we have helped, our partners have been able to shut down trafficking rings in Europe, Asia, Africa, and uncover and crack cases that had eluded law enforcement for years. So we saw we really started to see the potential of this, and our colleagues in IBM Security were really excited about this because it gave a really tangible example. I'm kind of talking about, what is the motivation for a company like IBM to do this work, is that our colleagues saw how this could be a really tangible example to help illustrate the power of the security technology applied in other fields in addition to anti-trafficking work. So, but we really saw this as the first step. As the more we got into this space, the more we saw the need and the opportunity to really make an impact. And we also saw that data and technology had a really important role to play here. And one of the challenges that really came to our attention and that we wanted to tackle was the challenge of data sharing and collaboration across geographies as well as across sector boundaries. So, data sharing can always be challenging, but especially in the case with data that is very sensitive, where there's a need to protect privacy and security, and the safety of people who are sharing that data. So we worked across sectors with kind of consortium of partners from law enforcement, NGO partners, and law enforcement, NGO partners, and financial institutions to develop a data sharing platform, the Anti-Traffic Hub, which we launched recently in partnership with partners including University College London, financial institutions including Barclays and Western Union, and NGO partners such as Stop the Traffic and Liberty Global. And the concept here is that it's a secure data sharing platform, an analytical platform where our partners can contribute anonymized data, have that be blended with the data that's provided by the other partners, and then use the analytical tools within the platform to enrich their own analysis and contribute to their efforts to disrupt trafficking. So I can tell you a little bit more about what we did there, in addition to the data sets that our partners are providing, we are using IBM's Watson AI capabilities to read 200,000 news sources daily and scan them for news about trafficking incidents and activities, and then extract data from those news sources to enrich the kind of data that's manually gathered and provided by our partners. And I'll show you a little bit more about that in a second. But this hub is something that we built on the IBM cloud platform. Safety and security, or security of that data, was really paramount to us because of the sensitivity of the issue. And so that's something that we kind of designed into it from the beginning. So let me show you a little bit more about, give you some examples of how we've use this. So this is a heat map. This is kind of the first layer of data. This is what's provided by our NGO partners. There's a whole bunch of individual data points in here that might contain information such as what's the geographical location? Is it an origin or transit or destination location? What type of trafficking or subtype of trafficking was involved? Demographic information about the people involved as well. But the challenge here is, although we have a number of NGO partners who are contributing to their data, and everyone can pool this, and that's better than what they had before, it's still a relatively incomplete map of information. Gathering data in this way is manual and labor-intensive, curated. It's very high-quality data, but it's difficult to scale, and it's not enough volume to do predictive analytics. So we augment that with the data that our Watson AI engine is drawing out of these hundreds of thousands of news sources that are being scanned daily. And as you can see, there's kind of lights up with additional information of all these additional data points. And these data points are kind of automatically added in and contain the kinds of information I was describing that are added manually by our partners that are extracted automatically from the news sources. So that might, again, include demographic information, the type of trafficking, the type of the location, and so on. The next kind of analytical tool we put in here is an example. This is kind of a first iteration of our financial anomalies analysis. So working with the data that our financial institutional partners are providing, they're coming in with data sets of financial transactions that have been flagged as anomalous. And some of this is going to be perfectly legitimate activity, but some of it is also suspicious of being illicit activity. So we're then mapping that against the data in those heat maps to be able to discern and give the first kind of iteration as a proximity alert. So if you have financial data that is, or a financial transaction that is happening in close proximity to places where there are high rates of trafficking activities in a particular time frame, then it will alert the financial institution that this is potentially a case of trafficking, so that they can further investigate it within their kind of process. And then the last thing I want to show you is a non-geographical kind of view of the analytical tools, where our NGO partners can look at and analyze things like what are the most popular, not popular is not the right word for it, the highest incidence rates of transit destinations for a particular subtype of trafficking or in a particular time frame. Lots of different filters that they can put on this to be able to discern new patterns. So this is, so kind of overall, this is an example of one of a handful of tools that we've built out and made available to the anti-trafficking community, and worked in partnership not only with academic institutions and NGO partners and law enforcement, but with other corporations, starting with financial institutions, but also in talks now with retail, hospitality, other industries where there is a high incidence of trafficking. And so, all of these corporations, all these entities, but from a corporate perspective, these corporations have an incentive and a desire to eliminate trafficking from their supply chains, from their labor force. And so we are, our aim is to provide a place for people who are doing these efforts in a lot of kind of disparate ways and making a lot of our partners making some really important progress, but how do we pool it so that some of our efforts is greater than the individual parts. And this is, we've just launched this, and we're really excited to continue to work with a broad range of stakeholders on it. It becomes more and more valuable the more data that people contribute into and are able to draw from. So, if anyone is interested in potentially being a part of this and contributing data and being able to use it, please come talk to me.
Perfect. We now have the great joy of James in a discussant role, and I've asked him to talk for no longer than 5 minutes before we throw it open to everybody else.
There'll be an alarm if I go over. Do I get to bang the gavel if I go under?
Yes, gavel bang is good.
Okay. So the topic for this discussion is entitled Creating Incentives for Action, Research, Regulation and Rewards. And in listening to the interventions then, it struck me that we heard quite a bit about research and rewards, not much about regulation, which is interesting. Also, when we juxtapose it with one of the mantras in this area that we were reminded of yesterday, that platform is policy and code is law. The reason I want to raise that at this point is that regulation in these areas may not only be a state role, if I can put it that way. So in a sense, perhaps we're right not to focus on regulation in terms of structuring incentives for action, but focus more on resources and rewards. And think about how all of the different actors that we've heard from now, or that we've heard about, universities, national science foundations, tech actors, even all of you in your own organizations can embed incentives in your ways of working, your relationships, to encourage action in a certain direction. But the question then is, what direction do we want to encourage it in? And that brings us back to the very questions of strategy that we were touching on earlier. And here I'm actually going to take my inspiration in a rather perverse way, apologies Dan, from CCC. It strikes me that the kind of problem we're wrestling with here is similar to cancer and climate change, in the sense that they are both big, complex research problems. Cancer is many things, of course, actually, and needs to be broken down, just as modern slavery is. Similarly, climate change is actually a product of many complex interacting variables and processes producing certain outcomes through convergence. But they're also public policy problems. They're not just research problems, they're public policy problems. And they're problems about thinking about what action do we want to motivate through nudges and incentives. Take the fabulous platform that Sophia just showed us. As we were just discussing in the previous session, the way that that data is structured and validated and represented, and the way that access to it is provided, is highly structuring of behaviour. So there are all sorts, back to the platform is policy, there are all sorts of policy choices embedded in the way that platform is built and being operated. So this is just in a sense to tee us up for the discussion session now and then the final session. I think we're at a pretty fundamental inflection point where we need to think about what the actions are that we're trying to encourage, and not just in terms of what actions reduce slavery, but what are the actions, and I come back to climate change and cancer here, what are the actions we collectively as a research and policy community want to undertake for the next 3-5 years to drive forward our understanding of this problem and what works to end it? Again, think of cancer. We don't have a strategy to end cancer, but we do have quite sophisticated, complex, multi-year research strategies that are joined up to research, rewards, and to some extent regulation. The same is emerging in climate change. Allocation of resources drives the distribution of postdoctoral positions or research funding or work by different tech actors in certain directions. I think that's the moment we're in now. We need to think about how we organize ourselves to incentivize that kind of research and applied work to improve our understanding. Did I make it on time?
Great. Fantastic. I have a couple of responses to James myself, but I don't want to hog the microphone, and I would like to bring in some other voices. So could I get just a couple hands initially, maybe 2 or 3 questions, and then we'll start feeding back. Was that Jessica? Great.
So I feel like something has kind of gone unsaid as we talk specifically about the role of government, and you brought up earlier. There is the sort of generalized consideration that any law, rule, or regulation is only as good as it is enforced. And that's true in climate change as well. But even more than that, I think that I haven't heard many people in this conversation voice an understanding of how government might be involved in trafficking. And I think that that affects our data in a lot of different ways. So to give folks in the room who maybe aren't direct service providers or survivors more examples, my students have in some cases estimated that as many as 30% of their clientele while they were being trafficked were police officers, prosecutors, and even intelligence officials in Virginia. So we should be aware that reporting someone to the police or seeking data from the police about a report may not always be a perfect proxy for the data that we get. In Myanmar, when we interviewed survivors, we had the translation recorded and retranslated by a US-based speaker who discovered that the anti-trafficking committee officials in the room were encouraging the children to tell us about arrests of what was clearly a low-level official who was not really involved, to point out how they had done something about the problem. I think that these, obviously I don't know the full scope of how any government in the world is involved, and to what extent the officials are aware, to what extent it's codified, but I think that it's important as we enter into this conversation to at least take into account that a government actor isn't always going to be the perfect actor. There's an additional consideration that my co-founder generally points out on our behalf, but is that a country's tip report status has become a sort of interesting incentive system to avoid reporting what's really going wrong, which I think is something that we should also probably take into account in the course of this conversation. Thanks.
Yeah, sure, please.
Yeah, so I think you make a really good point, and some of the work that we've seen is, of course, we are collaborating with law enforcement, but also the degree to which there's corruption, complicity, and that is something that we're very concerned about. Some of the cases that our partners have engaged in have led to, like there was one incident in Thailand and Myanmar that led to the arrest of a whole kind of chain of corrupt government officials that crossed the legislative and judicial and executive branches. And so by kind of not preferencing, someone based on where they're from, but just looking at the transactions that they had, uncovering some of the behaviors that seemed anomalous, they were able to get down to the root of a whole chain of people who were complicit in the work.
Anyone else on the panel want to come in on that? James, did you have, it's fine if not, anything from the organised crime background you've got, or any work on Delta 8.7 drawing down data from governments, where you wanted to jump in on this question?
Well, yeah, and I'm actually going to bring in a question from social media. Austin, where's Austin hiding? Was just saying, okay, if you can't rely on the state, how do you develop a global strategy? And I think actually climate's really interesting here. Save me typing back an answer to you, Austin. Because increasingly we see that we can't rely on states to take action against climate change, because many of them have embedded in their constitutional system, say, an upper house that is beholden to rural and commercial interests that don't want to fight climate change, for example. So where are we seeing leadership? We're seeing leadership at the city level. So you see coalitions of city or sub-national, provincial legislators take action, set targets, mobilise around shared research agendas, embed public policy incentives. You still need the state at some point, obviously. There are certain things that can't be done at the sub-national level, but there are other possibilities, and I think there's action going on in Rights Lab and elsewhere to think about how we can connect up local level action on modern slavery. That may be where the contextual knowledge is actually most reliable.
I would echo that and just point out, if anyone's interested, there is a slavery-free city network that Nottingham, where the Rights Lab is based, is part of, that Bergen in Norway, Melbourne, Austin, Texas, somewhere here in New Jersey, that I'm blanking on the town, have all committed to becoming slavery-free cities and communities and are sharing a lot of knowledge and multi-stakeholder initiatives back and forth to understand what all cities might have in common as strategies. So I agree with that it's really interesting. I think Phil had a question, and then Anjali.
Yeah, thank you. I was interested in the analogy with tackling cancer, which is quite interesting. Perhaps it's interesting to me to see whether there is a strategy, for example, on prevention of cancer, connected to the medical aspects of tackling cancer, and is there a strategy actually to tackle lifestyle choices and other things like that in some parts? But it's an interesting analogy, but probably needs to be thought about more. What I wanted to say briefly, and I was interested actually in what Keith you were saying about sort of breadth and depth and things like this. The thing that's missing from the conversation that I've seen is about how the community, particularly in research, connects with and works with other capabilities within the whole community of organisations tackling slavery. And since I've been involved in this, I've continuously heard the theme of we need to collaborate more, we need to be building partnerships. And back in the for-profit world, which is the area I know most, we talk about two types of community. So a community is like us here. One type of community is a community of interest. A group of people, group of organisations who have a shared interest. They share knowledge, we do presentations, it's great. The other type of community is a community of intent. And a community of intent is a group of people from different organisations who have a plan, who have a strategy, who are connected with technology, who have a measurable outcomes, who have a cycle of analytics and data to measure those outcomes. And this is what I think we're missing. If you look at, say, the way big tech companies work, take Google or Salesforce or Microsoft, when they invent a new product, it's not just a product team, one capability, who invents a product and then sticks it out there and go, hey, we've done. What they do, right, all of the different capabilities in that huge company, from marketing, from sales, the service teams, the product teams, the consulting teams who talk with their customer, they're all connected in that community of interest with urgency to drive out that product and make a dent. That's why they scale enormously. It's a relatively few number of people, actually, but they are connected. And often they don't know each other, but they're connected through technology, collaboration, and there's a continuous cycle of collection of data and analytics, and they are refining what they are doing and adjusting their product based on feedback and et cetera, and it's iterative, and that's how they scale, and it works. And they're spread across the world, it's a 24-hour thing, and it's... So I think we need to be thinking more about these communities of intent. And what's missing, what's preventing us from doing that, I think, is some of the core technological infrastructures that will begin to connect these different groups. And I think one barrier to getting those sorted out is that, unfortunately, a lot of that falls under the pernicious title of overhead. All right? Everyone likes sort of buying cars, but no one enjoys paying for roads. Now, we're going to have to pay for some roads in order to get the type of outcomes that I think we're talking about here. And maybe one sort of useful thing to start thinking about is, what are the roads that we need to build? What are these core lumps of infrastructure that are going to start tying together all of the different groups? I've seen some great research over the last day or two, and that's fantastic, but how does that feed into becoming operationalized, living? How do we make that come to life? And how does that connect with an NGO? So it may be that an NGOs that I know in India are not really interested in reading websites of reports and graphs and other things. They need a contextualized outcome of this initiative. They need to be consumers and subscribers of this infrastructure that I'm talking about. So we need to create an ecosystem of research, building models, of subscribers to those models, taking action, feeding back into the data, support, That's a kind of thing. And I don't have all the answers, but I think that's the direction we're going to have if we're going to amplify. And I think if we can prove that concept, that will attract more funding. I think that will happen. We've got to try and prove that.
Fantastic. I'm sure my panelists have thoughts, but can I just throw it open to the room and people who maybe haven't chimed in yet, haven't had a chance to speak? This seems like a really big and important point from Phil about how anti-slavery or anti-slavery technology as a community moves from being one of interest to intent. Any thoughts from anybody else in the room we haven't heard from? Yes, please.
So I'm currently with the Y, previously Senior Research Associate at Urban Institute, nonprofit research organization. I've done research on labor trafficking and sex trafficking in the US and other countries, and currently still work with the federally funded task forces. I agree with everything Phil has said previously and others. It's a fascinating conversation. Just on the point of strategy, I guess from a US perspective and thinking about how this could also apply in other countries, I think it's important to map the existing infrastructure and the existing research. So what do we already know? What don't we know? What are those gaps? In terms of the infrastructure, who are the players on the ground right now? And what are their resources? What data do they actually generate on a daily basis? And what are the challenges that they have? Because it occurs to me to play on the phrase hidden in plain sight, that there's a lot of data hidden in plain sight in the work that I and others have done over the years, working with law enforcement, for example. The human trafficking task forces in the United States are some of the more innovative areas where there's work happening on the ground. There's identification of survivors and prosecution of traffickers. But we still don't have, for example, we can't answer the question of how many state human trafficking cases have been prosecuted because we don't have a system that connects that data. Law enforcement in a lot of communities, they're entering things into Excel spreadsheets they've come up with on their own. Caseworkers, they're not generating usually a lot of detailed case information because they specifically don't collect it to protect themselves from being subpoenaed. So in the research side, we found a lot of information in some of the legal filings, but that's going to give you a tip of the iceberg in terms of the information you're going to collect. But that minus researchers getting funded by NIJ, for example, in the United States, which sets the research agenda, to then go out and hand collect that information. That information's out there, but it's not really being captured. And I think AI could play an important role in bolstering the existing systems that we already have in place. So I would just encourage a conversation around learning, both in the United States as well as other states, what does that infrastructure look like and what are the needs and how can AI better support folks on the ground? So thank you.
Fantastic. So responding to that idea of how we become a community of intent, this idea of mapping existing infrastructure, research, coming up with better shared systems for storing data, thinking about AI for data capture and bolstering existing systems. Any other responses to that challenge Phil threw down about intentional communities? Yep.
Move to Humanity United. I was just reflecting on both your presentation, which was great to hear what IBM's doing, and then James, your really high-level frame for us to think strategically big picture. And I was remembering that this isn't the first time that we as a community have gotten together and talked about the barriers and the issues around data sharing and the opportunities that it provides. And I don't know, I hope this is the last, because then we can get beyond these barriers. But I think we really need to put back on the table what is the reason for why those previous attempts did not work. And there's two things in my mind, and one of them gets to the point that you just said down here, that there is real issue and risk and concern if you are a frontline service provider to provide your data on the victims that you are supporting, because there is an issue of trust. And that's either an issue of trust with the individual person who is collecting the data, whether it's a company, or it's a trust in the individual government in which you're operating within. So it's something that we just need to be aware of. And then I think it comes back to the incentive piece, right? So there was a conversation a number of years ago where we got in a room and we had this dialogue about sharing data. And we got really far down the pipeline on working with a private sector partner about sharing data. And then the question came, well, what benefit do I get from sharing my data with you? Because you're going to turn around and you're potentially going to monetize that. So it's another thing that we need to just put on the table, that there are some really human behavioral reasons for why we have not figured out how to tackle this problem. I'm really encouraged by the call to action. I really love the frame, but I think if we kind of talk around these issues, that we potentially are going to be in this room in another 5 years with the same exact problem. But guess what? The computing capacity and our ability to solve the problem will be that much more farther advanced than we are today. So let's, I think, just make sure that we continue to keep that in mind as we talk through this discussion.
Perfect. Thank you. Yeah.
From Polaris. And it occurs to me from the practitioner side, there's a lot of fear in engaging in this, not only because it's potentially monetized, but also we've seen what happens with the ethos of move fast and break things in Silicon Valley. And I'm wondering if we don't need more public examples of good data use to show us how it can be done safely.
Anyone got another example of really good data use they want to share? Yeah. Okay, is there a mic you've got? Have you got a microphone near you?
There is a research data consortium or association which can advise on good ways to share data. So that's one that you could look at. And they have models from different organizations like the chemists and so on. So they're not pushing one forward. They're rather to provide models that might be used. And then in terms of sharing data, we might look to the medical researchers. So if you want to publish your studies in top medical journals, the top medical journals will not allow those papers in unless you have put your data in a publicly available repository. And I would suggest that that might be something that CCC, for example, might push with its journals to take leadership in that area. And there's another journal, sorry to interrupt you, Louise. What is the journal, the Human Trafficking Journal out of Nevada? Journal of Human Trafficking. So, who would have guessed? So if you want articles to be published and you want their data, you can use that as an incentive to do that.
Thank you. I'm going to ask Dan to respond on behalf of CCC to that suggestion.
Well, I think it's a wonderful suggestion, and all of us should do more to share our data. There's no question about that. That's the only way we can accomplish things together is a community of action. I guess I got some good news and bad news. The good news is that this is a very well-known problem, not just beyond this community, but I mentioned this idea of AI, basic fundamental AI research in the US. And clearly, we know our researchers are competing with industry with massive resources and massive data, not all of which has been applied, to society's good. Those companies are starting to come to a realization that they need to do that. But whatever they do, the research community needs its own support. Otherwise, there'll be no competition. It'll be impossible for us to compete as researchers. And this has all kinds of workforce issues looking forward for the universities, what universities are able to do to educate students if the best place to be to do research is actually in industry. So it's a big enough problem, I think, that it's going to have to be solved. But the bad news is also it's a huge, huge problem. It's one of those conundrums. But I think there's going to be focused attention on this within the context of the bigger discussions around AI and AI activities, because we simply can't advance AI research, basic AI research, without the same magnitude of data that the companies are able to monetize. We wouldn't want to monetize them. We also need the techniques that are going to preserve and privacy and anonymity. Those are also considered to be basic research questions too. So, in some sense, some of the big science models will work well, ignoring that particular issue. But when we start talking about the sensitivity of this data, there's a whole set of other research questions that have to be answered there as well.
Thank you. And before I come over to Davina, can I just bring Killian back in and ask you just really briefly, when you got quite far down the road with people sharing data and the question came up of what's in it for me, did anyone try and make an argument for what that incentive is? Did it land at all? Can you remember anything more about the conversation? And
I mean, there's a lot of conversations around how you build a model that's, and also if you're coming at this as a company or as a building a model that's self-sustaining, it makes sense that you need to figure out a financial model behind it. I mean, we have a venture fund, a philanthropic venture fund. We're investing in emerging technology to address this problem. So we're looking for scalable solutions.
Yeah.
And one of the reasons why we said this wasn't going to work is because there wasn't a way to create real incentives that was beneficial to the people providing the data that's unstructured in a way that it actually would become scalable. So you fundamentally, as we begin tackling this, we can't forget of what are the drivers that are going to continue to prohibit somebody's interest in using this system. It can be the best system out there. It can be the best app ever. But if there is fundamental reasons for why people aren't willing to use it, whether that's trust or that's not feeling like there isn't a reciprocal benefit to do it, then it just isn't going to go anywhere.
that's interesting. James?
I think Gillian raises really important points. I also think that the world looks slightly different than it did when that round of discussions happened for two reasons. First of all, I think the tools that we're talking about bringing into the mix now actually alter the decision-making structure for an organisation that's thinking about contributing data to a public good or a shared collective effort, because one potential payoff from contributing is improved understanding of the effectiveness of your activity, and therefore potentially efficiency gains or profit if that's what floats your boat, or basically there's a possibility here that by contributing data to a shared analytic effort, you actually get direct knowledge back as your payoff. The second is the funding landscape is different now than it was 4 or 5 years ago. There are new players, there are new states involved, new private funders, new foundations and funds, and in a way, I think the discussion we're having now is actually partly about trying to, considering influencing their behaviours and what they're investing in. So I think it is, I understand the reticence to go over ground that has been tried and tested and failed, but I also think it's worth thinking this through while there's such momentum for such an initiative.
I would agree with that, but let me bring Hannah in.
That was actually what was come to mind for me as well in the previous conversation, is looking at the funding landscape and the role of funders in this battle or ongoing fight against trafficking, is that, as Andrew Zoli, I believe, was mentioning yesterday, we have to change the way that funders are providing grants to these issues. We have to encourage them to provide overhead funding, but also to look at the new roles that are needed in nonprofits that aren't currently baked into the system. So those tech experts, those that are looking at data, the data scientists, building out the capacity of NGOs to actually build up data structures and consider privacy and a lot of the other topics that we've been discussing today. And this is a drum I think I've been beating for a few years now on provided unrestricted funding. And I think that that's something that a few funders are doing, but not a whole lot. I know Humanity United has a great venture fund. The Skoll Foundation provides some unrestricted funding, but there's a lot that are just funding very specific projects or have delineations around their funding that really prevent scaling of a lot of these initiatives. So as a group, I would just also add on another call to action. Sorry to get too many in there, but I think that we can help as a unit to create a better incentive or model for funding larger scale projects. And I'm not exactly sure how to go about that, but I'd love for that to be a consideration for this group as well.
Is Kelly here in the room somewhere? And if so, do you want to chime in at all based on the research you've just done? I know it's different because it's about aid rather than philanthropy, but is there any lessons you want to throw out for people who didn't have the chance to hear you yesterday? On a mic.
I think in terms of, we're talking about funding to specific projects and specific goals. It's difficult to so the information is there, but it is not structured in a way that is as usable as we'd like it to be. Plus, a lot of times when we're talking about reporting back to a donor, we're talking in terms of immediate gains. And so when you talk about long-term development of data structures, it's not so immediate that you can see the bang for your buck. So I think that's a major issue. But I really like the comment about building in more data scientists to these institutions, to NGOs, because now that the tools are so available online, the software is open, the data is open, and we have all of these things available. It just takes the brains to put this together, and so it's not as difficult a venture as I think sometimes we assume. So.
Thank you. Davina.
Okay, so just two quick comments on that. So for an example of a public good, or another public example of where data sharing has been really successful, and under my academic hat, I'm part of the American Statistical Association's Statistics Without Borders group, and basically we provide pro bono statistical consulting to nonprofits. So they're sharing very sensitive data with a group of consultants that they don't really know, and it seems to be most effective when we do these kinds of projects to go one-on-one, kind of like to what Killian was saying, like building that relationship and rapport under the auspices of like an academic umbrella, but less an academic umbrella where there's like a university and multiple individual researchers perhaps, but maybe an association that has some level of I guess it's hard for me to explain how they might perceive these differences, but it's my sense that we've been very successful because they think that it's kind of one consultant doing this project that isn't necessarily publishing actively in their field and may have some incentive to then take the information further beyond where the stakeholders would want to use it. The second point kind of builds on that, and that's to Killian's comments about the data environment. And it definitely, to James, I totally agree, it's completely different. I mean, we would not have been able to conduct MSc in 6 different countries by now if that data environment wasn't completely different. These are national governments sharing their anti-trafficking information with us for the purpose of estimating who they're not identifying. So this was seen as like almost impossible, but now we have that data. And one of the things we keep hearing back from the governments is that in order to make this better, what they want to see is a unified data collection system throughout Europe that they are all willing to participate into. What's missing is actually funding. So it's an interesting thing because we kind of have a problem set, we have a solution in mind, and we have willing participants, and then it just comes down to aligning funding with that.
Thank you. I had a hand over here on this side of the room. Yes.
Actually done specific research on the question that you asked about what were things that would cause people to overcome or would feel incentivized. I think the obvious one is funding. Like there's an obvious, like, even a small amount of financial compensation for participating in a platform. But this was specifically in the context of getting multiple service providers across different parts of the anti-trafficking landscape to collaborate and send referrals back and forth. And initially, people introduced like broad privacy and security concerns. But what we discovered is that they weren't actually concerned about privacy and security based on, they just didn't understand how data would be secured. So if I say a hash or encryption or de-identification or anonymization to most anti-trafficking service providers on the ground, I may as well have just said like balderdash. They don't know what that word means. So we need a better way to explain to them what security actually does to data and what those procedures can do to make the data more usable. That's the first thing. The second thing is any software will be adopted only if it delivers a value proposition to the user. And for a referral, a standardization and automation of referral platform, a value add that was literally elucidated to me as sufficient to get me to use a new platform was, could you print me the name, contact information, and directions that I can hand to somebody to get them to the person I'm referring them to? Like it's that we're at the level of like someone taking time to handwrite and draw a map and write out directions because someone doesn't have a mobile phone with Google Maps. So there is a lot of thirst for it, but I think I don't think we've done a good job thus far at elucidating the value proposition to users.
Thank you. Any comments, especially from people who haven't spoken yet in the last couple of days or in particular today? Any voices I haven't heard from? Yeah.
Hi, I'm Ryan. I'm a data scientist at Vadersk Maplecroft. So thinking about this data sharing problem, I think something you might want to look forward to beyond that is, suppose you have shared data. One of the things you might want to think about is shared compute power. So as technology advances and these models grow larger and larger, one of the things you're going to be dealing with as small organizations that are disbanded is you won't have the computing power to do what you want to do, and creating a sort of data trust, but for computing.
Any just initial responses to that particular suggestion from people? Yeah.
Another hat I wear with IBM is I run our shared computing, volunteer computing initiative. So if that is something that is of interest to this group, the way it works is that we essentially take problems that would normally be run on high capacity throughput computing, supercomputers, and break it down into tiny pieces that can then be distributed to volunteers' laptops or mobile devices. It's free for the researchers. There are some specific kinds of computational problems that can and cannot be distributed in this way. And of course, there would be a lot of things to think through in terms of the anonymization of the data, security, and all of those things. But it's a resource that we could potentially offer, thinking about.
So if people want to take up that offer, what do they have to do?
What we need is to understand what is the research question, and then we need to have a basically an algorithm or program of what is it that you want to run, and then we can examine whether or not it's technologically feasible.
Okay, so they email you?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Over here, yeah.
I'm Shannon Stewart. I'm from the Global Fund to End Modern Slavery, although I'm speaking from a past experience. So on the question of incentivizing data sharing, I think there doesn't necessarily need to be a binary choice between privacy and security and sharing. And for instance, when we want to encourage businesses to share data because we don't want them to compete on the basis of forced labor, there are models in semiconductors, in pharmaceuticals, where companies come together and share data on a neutral third, like a convening platform that doesn't disclose publicly, to try to, so the incentive there would be comply with the Modern Slavery Act, for instance, as an industry together. So that might be something to think about, something that could be hosted on an academic platform, for instance.
Great. So would you, if we came back to you, be able to share an example of that or a screenshot of how it looks or something if we're thinking about it? Just if we came back to you after the conference? Yeah. Okay, brilliant. I had a hand over here. I think you have to lean forward, find a mic, or take someone's chair temporarily.
It's always good to have more women around the table. I'm joking. Chloe from Lumos. I wanted to talk about, I like the idea about, it's something we use a lot in our organisation, the concept of philanthropic advocacy. So obviously we're an NGO, we have to go out and get funding like all NGOs, but a lot of what we do when we're talking to funders, and initially the first conversation we have with funders is about whether their funding is working and how they can critically analyse it. So in our case, it's about orphanages, and obviously we're saying lots of funders fund orphanages, and we're asking them to look at whether that's the most effective use of their money and try and convince them to not give, but to transition their money into alternatives which are better for children. And it's a core part of our kind of philanthropic approach. And I think there's definitely ways that we can build into that concepts around using technology, using solutions as part of that broader discussion about how to influence them. And the other point I wanted to make, someone talked before about how do we collaborate better, because obviously events like this are an excellent way in which we can network and meet individuals and hopefully come up with ideas that we take away. But there's also an example that I found quite useful that we've been able to utilise is, so for example, Thomson Reuters Foundation have a service that they call Trust Law, where NGOs put forward a concept of something that they want help with from lawyers. So it's specifically for legal help, legal research, legal advice. And then it gets put forward to multiple law firms globally, and then they kind of pitch if they think that they can help you in a pro bono way. And it can be the one that we've just worked on recently is 10 law firms globally working together, all different ones. It was quite complicated to get all the MOUs signed off. But it was a really good example of like the NGOs often know best what the problem is they want to be solved, and to have an avenue to be able to pitch that. And I wonder if there's an equivalent that we could do here, where it's kind of pairing or matching NGOs which have ideas or problems that they need to be solved, and matching that with the people who have the technical knowledge, because otherwise it's kind of just luck whether we happen to speak to the right person, or, do you know what I mean? Yeah, thank you.
Can I get a quick show of hands just from the anti-slavery, human rights, or practitioner community, if that was on offer, whether people at some point would consider taking advantage of it? So if there was a group of tech people willing to do stuff, for you, with you? Can I get a show of hands from the tech community if you think you and your companies, your industry would ever, be up for that in the way that lawyers apparently have been in a pro bono way? All right, cool.
Funders to that discussion as well, and it could almost be like then we could jointly pitch ideas once we've collaborated and come up, like worked them out and how we might go approach it, and then that might be something that larger funders are open to doing as a program.
Yeah, let's go here because we haven't heard from you yet, and then over to Anjali.
Back and actually tie in kind of the two most recent comments about the shared platforms that, whether it's in pharma or you even talked about the semiconductor industry. Yes, SRC is a great platform for industry to come together and collaborate together in a non-proprietary way. But the problem with bringing it to this model is that there are also major incentives for them to work together and then bring it back because it's a profit center for them individually. Here we don't have that profit center. If we bring organizations together, it's not a profit center for people, it's a social good, which is extremely important, but it gets back to the issue of incentives, and which is why I think we need to really hammer on what are the global incentives that can encourage people to actively work together on these platforms that we need to create, not just in sharing data, because data needs to be curated and it needs to be broader platforms so that we can get the governments there. I really think it has to get back to the incentives.
I just want to jump in on that because that may be true, but it may not be true. It may be that if we understand modern slavery risk better, we can actually embed it in investment strategies. This is one of the things discussed on the FinTech panel, in a way that allows you to profit from putting your capital behind organizations that have a lower modern slavery risk profile than those that have a higher one. So it's not about liability reduction or risk reduction, it's actually making it a profit center. And that, if that's where we're on the verge of beginning to understand that, and if that's true, it actually, again, changes the sources of the decision-making structure here.
So I want to address two things. One is around the data sharing conversation, and actually just recently about the opportunity to where the tech community could support in a similar way to the legal community in this space. So from the data sharing side, I guess, not to throw another monkey wrench in there, but I will, is that, well, first of all, I think there's a distinction between data sharing and open data. And we need to be clear on that and what we're actually trying to do here, and that there might be some sources of data that could be more easily made open, and that we could start to develop tools and support the community. And for the ones which, the types of data that might be more challenging, we can also consider where we've raised privacy methods, so differential privacy methods, developing synthetic data that people can then make use of to then still further the combating modern slavery in different ways. So
I put that out there, but from the monkey wrench perspective, it was different jurisdictions might have different legal frameworks around what can be made open, shareable. And so as we think in this global space, I think that's something that we need to think about. I'm not sure if we've got lawyers, QCs engaged in this. I am currently in the UK speaking with those people that have been involved in the drafting of the legislation for the Modern Slavery Act to think about this going forward as we look to build data science AI tools to think about both how these are going to play a role in prosecution, ensuring that these tools are valid and reliable, but also thinking about the wider implications in terms of access to justice in this space. So I think I encourage that if we can, there might be some other people that need to be brought to the table in this discussion. And then to address the other point is that, so Keith had also sort of said from the academic standpoint that there are several avenues in terms of, I would say, graduate students, or graduate programs, which often have capstone projects and areas which can be utilized as ways to explore solving some of the data problems and working with NGOs. I know particular institutions that do this really well. And so, but even more so, there is programs such as machine learning for social good and data science for social good, and there is a program around data science for social good, which started at the University of Chicago. It is a wider network, which has a 12-week program in which NGOs, government, all apply in a similar way to say, this is a problem we've got. And then these institutions hold a 12-week program in which people work to sort of solve that particular problem in that span of time. And the Turing Institute is participating in this, and we are currently looking at curating, so taking in those applications at the moment. So it is one that I put out there that the Turing Institute is doing this, but there is a wider network and program that is currently doing that. So I would encourage some of those NGO communities or government that are looking to try and harness some of these expertise to explore those opportunities. And I'm happy to sort of share where those links are too.
Great, thank you. Ben, can I check if there's any social media questions that people have sent in? Oh, you could have made one up. Come on. All right, we're starting to enter the last couple minutes, but yes, please.
Good afternoon. My name is David Powell. I'm here from Interpol. Thank you for organizing this event. In 2018, Interpol launched the Global Policing Goals, which are an effort to supplement and help implement the UN Sustainable Development Agenda. One of the targets that are most relevant to Interpol's work is 8.7, and it relates to the Global Policing Goal number 3, targeting protecting vulnerable communities. Now, going back to the question of data security, that's Interpol's bread and butter. That's what we do. We share information securely between law enforcement at an international level, whether or not it's through our notice systems, through our various databases or analytical reports. There's a big role for Interpol to play in implementing these sustainable development goals, and particularly in providing a tangible means for member states to meet their obligations under the agenda. Not only do we work with law enforcement, we also have partnerships with local social support services. So, for example, when there's an Interpol-supported operation to conduct counter-trafficking, post-operation and post-rescue, Interpol can facilitate forming these partnerships. And lastly, what I just wanted to touch on is we tend to overlook that the extent to which technology, for example, tools developed with the use of artificial intelligence can be shared throughout the world. For example, in places where there might not be internet access, how are frontline workers going to access those tools? that's a way that Interpol can come into play through the Global Secure Communication System, otherwise known as I-24/7. So that's really what I want to touch on. If anyone has any other questions or is open to any dialogue, I'm welcome after. Thank you.
Perfect, thank you. Any responses to that or new questions, especially from new voices we haven't heard from? I want to make sure I don't miss anyone. Yeah.
A few years ago, we had some big national meetings about incidents, and there was a lot of incentives to do small projects and make mistakes. And I feel like that has changed again, and we're going big data, big projects, multi-million-dollar. And I feel like we're a little bit out of the range of experimentation and making mistakes like we need to as we build that ladder I spoke about before. So we have so much laddering to do on our knowledge that going big is part of it. But I do think that there needs to be a space for multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary work that might have great failures, that failure is our strength. So I'm not a funder, I'm a university, and I get little bits and pieces of money from lots of different places, so I can make mistakes. If I accept a $20,000 gift to practice, to learn something, to try a new methodology, to explore something, I'm much safer and much more likely to get something bigger later. But if it's a mess and I don't, doesn't do what we want, we have a little bit lower loss. But all those relationships that are built are so important. So I want us to, as we talk about funding, to not only talk about the big wins, the big donations, but I do think that there needs to be some incentivizing for me to meet the people in my computer sciences division and those folks to meet people in social sciences. And they don't, again, have to be I don't need 30% of my time and such a huge commitment. How can we kind of date, right? How can we find ways to get to know, but also find ways to experiment? So I just want to make sure that we consider that opportunity, not all so global, big huge money, big huge like ASU supporting a satellite is far away, but we sure can do some surveying. We sure could try some capture recapture. That's quite interesting, but it takes some time.
Can I ask James if he would like to jump on a mic and just talk from the perspective very briefly of having started out as a computer scientist and now becoming a social scientist and what that computational social science model looks like in the work that you do, very briefly?
Sure. So yeah, I guess I'm slightly unique that I've come from social science and computer science, so sort of a foot in both camps. So I'm not sure I can say too much about that in general. What I would say was just to follow on from the last point that we're seeing a lot of NGOs in the countries I'm working who do have very small data sets, so not big, huge data sets, but small piecemeal data sets. And I feel like there's a job of work to bring those together. And that sits in complementary with big corporate data sets and policing. And if we can do that and start building organically, I think that's the way forward.
I want to give the three panelists actually a quick chance to say anything that has come out of the discussion for them, anything you had wanted to ask this group based on your presentations that you feel like we didn't get to, any summing up points, and the same offer to James as well, to just cap us off.
I'm on. I guess I can start. I think this was a very open and fruitful discussion. I completely agree with this last point that we don't need a lot of money. What we need are different sources of money, different ways of bringing in fellowships. These two things I talked about, the Global Ties program at UC San Diego, that's all supported by one fellowship and industry putting in small amounts of money, and it's doing things like rebuilding bridges in Colombia. You can do an awful lot with a small amount of money as long as you get the right people there and the right incentives, which typically is having students feel like they're changing something important.
Sure. So the things that really resonated with me as I was listening to the different points that were being raised was this concept of infrastructure for the space and what are the different pieces of technology that can help with the communication, the data sharing, things that can help facilitate the building of trust. So The platform that we've built is something where we've spent a lot of time thinking about the governance model and transparency. And so we're the technology provider, but it's actually owned by a consortium of organizations cross-sector, and there are agreements that they're in the process of structuring about, what do you put in, what do you get out, the fact that everyone owns their own data, what are the agreements around how you can use it, within and outside of the consortium. And so those are all things that we don't have all the answers to, but it's another, to the point of the woman down at the end around experimentation. I think that will provide an interesting kind of experiment for a way that we can collaborate in this space. So I think that, so offer that as kind of one piece, definitely not a silver bullet or the whole solution. I think there's other pieces of kind of infrastructure that need to be developed in this space. Some of that needs to be kind of mapped out. The needs of a really kind of diverse set of stakeholders, James mentioning like very small NGOs with small data sets, people who have limited internet connectivity, for example, on the one hand, and then also like how can that be brought into play with large financial institutions that have, a whole bench of data analysts and all this technology and sophisticated ways that they're curating their data sets. Like how can we bring all of these things together and leverage the strengths of each?
Great. I would say that I'm incredibly impressed by the amount of shared common interest that I've heard over the past 2 days, not just in the problem we're going after, that would be obviously a shared common interest, but also in the technical issues and the technologies and some of the other challenges that we face. I think what I would just add is it's incredibly important. Every one of us, I think, is a specialist in one or two stages in that pipeline, but it's important to all of us to understand all of the stages, and that all of the stages are the care and feeding of all those stages, that they all need to be humming if we're actually going to make progress in this problem.
I think this session has done a brilliant job, actually, of almost starting to head into the next session, which James is moderating and chairing and introducing. So, James, do you think there's a way for you to wrap your thoughts on this session into your introduction for the next one in a really elegant way?
I'll just do one of them.
Okay, brilliant. So just before you do that, because it will mark the moment where we're kicking off the final session, because we are going to go straight through without a sort of formal break, and if we finish a bit early, that's fine. Could I get members of the organising committee who are not here, so Doreen, James, Nadia, to come sit in the organising committee chairs? And once you've done that, we'll ask James to kick us off.